topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I just have to announce that I don't live in Manhattan, nor have I ever lived in Manhattan. I actually live on Long Island, but leaving that aside, I also want to say I'm very happy to hear that Josh Teplitsky is going to be lecturing for you. He's a PhD from our department and a great success, and he's just won an award for that book, so it's great to see that you're having him. I want to say I know I went a little fast last time at the end of the lecture because of some not so great planning. We're going to be reviewing some of those things as we go along, so don't worry. Now, even though I am not going to be lecturing in any extensive way regarding the archaeology of Qumran, but there are a few things we're going to have to say about that in order to successfully discuss the question of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the history of Judaism. And to start with, we have to remind ourselves of the dates that we're talking about. The place was occupied between about 100 BCE and 68 CE. There are all kinds of theories of what the site might have been beforehand. There were some buildings that may have existed, but there certainly were some remnants also of an 8th century BCE. That means a period of the kings of Judea, some type of installation there, which include a round cistern, which is quite significant. But at any rate, the manuscripts date from anywhere between 225 BCE and 30 CE. Now, those dates are a combination of the letter shapes that we use to date, because we know something about the development of the language, and also carbon-14 dating. Now then, right, the date of the composition of the text is from whenever you date the Torah, question beyond us today, all the way through the turn of the era, about the year, there is no year zero, so 1 BCE and 1 CE. Now, also, we have to remember that the caves and the scrolls and the buildings we're taking as one phenomenon, and especially because of the fact that they have common pottery and certain, especially the so-called scroll jars, which are really not scroll jars, but whatever they were for, they represent a virtually Qumran-only phenomenon. Now, I should mention right now there are other dissonant theories about Qumran that don't relate Qumran and the Dead Sea Scroll. We are going to assume that they are related, since I understand that you may want to be hearing Jody Magnus. If you hear Jody Magnus on the archaeology, she'll take the time to prove that to you. But I am not going to have the time to prove that to you today. Now, continuing along, we have to understand that there are various periods of the occupation of the site. And as you can see on this chart, but we're really concerned with the period of the sectarians from 100 BCE to 68 CE, because we are going to accept what is the general theory that this area, and specifically these caves, here you see a picture of the entrance to Cave 1, here you see the Wadi, which, and you see Cave 4, opposite it, and other caves are located up in behind it, right, at any rate, and also closer to the site. And here you see the inside of Cave 4, where I think that these holes here may have supported shelves, and Cave 4 yielded something like 550 manuscripts. So at any rate, we take it, this is Cave 11, which is a cave from which you will learn that one of my favorite scrolls is the Temple Scroll. I'm about to have completed a 3rd book on this scroll. And we happen to have online watching, I noticed, right, watching a Marcello Fidanzio who excavated Cave 11. So we have a person who knows more about it than I do, but numerous scrolls were found in this cave. And we take it that this so-called settlement, as we term it, where you can see here the gray is the water system, which we're going to come back to a little bit, that this so-called settlement is the area that was occupied by a community that we call the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, and that most scholars identify with the group called the Essenes that are mentioned especially by Josephus and some other Greco-Roman authors. Josephus is writing in circa 100 of our era, but he begins to tell the story of the 3 sectarian groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, which is a simplified version of the sectarianism of Second Temple. But anyhow, he tells that story approximately when he gets to Jonathan the Hasmonean meaning the Maccabee brother, who takes control of the country in about 152 BCE. He's going to come up later in our discussion as being extremely important. And so Josephus discusses the sects at that point. Most scholars believe that this place was occupied by the Essenes. That can't actually be proven, but it is the most popular theory. I myself have raised some questions about the need to modify that theory and perhaps to see Essene as a kind of group of sectarian groups, especially because the word Essene is not mentioned in the Talmud, it's not mentioned in the New Testament, it's not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we don't even know what it really means. And the modern Hebrew Isiim is a term that started in the Renaissance, when Jews started to read works in Greek about ancient Jewish history. At any rate, this is a view from the top. I always tell the story that I once had a chance to be in a helicopter over Qumran and actually to experience this. And then the people who were going to take me found out they could buy the footage from a company that sells aerial footage in Israel. Apparently that company had some friends in the permit place where they have to give you a permit to fly a helicopter. So when the helicopter applied for a permit, they said, you don't need to do this. Go to our friends and buy the photos from them. So I missed the chance to take a photo like this myself. What can you do? Here's the water system coming in, the main aqueduct. Here's the round cistern. This is the area over here left over from 8th century BCE. We're going to see some other structures. You have here a fortress, little tower here, and then you have various areas, what they believe to have been a dining room and other areas here. We're going to see them quickly because we need to understand for our purposes what this center functioned as for this sectarian group. We're going to go way beyond this because, as I mentioned in my first lecture, I don't believe in studying the Dead Sea Scrolls to find out about 300-400 people who couldn't take it in the main society and went and ran away to the desert to live a life of perfect purity. I believe the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us about the whole situation of the Jewish community. But we've got to discuss who these people were and what they did and how they lived, the people who gathered the library. We don't want to ignore that. So now you're looking from the west towards what you see behind it, which of course is the Dead Sea. And you can see here the tower, which stands here. I always jokingly tell people that you can buy many books at Qumran by people like me for 4 times the price. You're better off buying them from Amazon. But at any rate, right, this is the defensive tower that existed there. This has yielded some silly theories about claiming that Qumran really was a Roman fortress. These are the core buildings. I want to just quickly show you that this is based on some beautiful building that they had here, because all this would have been lined with limestone and the floor would have been paved and it would have been a beautiful place. But what's important for us is to take a look at a few of these structures, because this is believed here to be a communal dining room. And this communal dining room, which may have had up in the front some type of a platform, was where the communal meals of this group were served. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you certain features that we're going to see are actually in the scrolls describing the sectarian group. So here I want to review a point from last time. There are basically 3 kinds of scrolls. Some people want to make it 4, but they're basically 3 kinds of scrolls. There's our Hebrew Bible. Everything except Esther has got some representation. We discussed that at great length last time. Then we have what we call apocryphal works. They're works of Second Temple Jews that we know existed elsewhere in the country, either because they were passed down to us or because they're part of the Greek apocryphal texts in the Septuagint, the Greek Bible that eventually got into our Catholic Bibles of today, or because they are otherwise represented in Second Temple times. But anyhow, and some were found at Masada. These are general Second Temple type literature. Then we have the third type of material, the sectarian literature, which describes the way of life and some of the strange beliefs of this sectarian group that apparently went to this place in about 100 BCE, maybe a little before, maybe a little after, and continued to occupy it until it was destroyed by the Romans in 68 CE. Now, how do we know that this is a dining room? Because right next to it, there was a pantry. And how do I know it was a pantry? Here is J.T. Joseph Millick excavating the site in the 50s with some 1,200 dishes. And here you could see the actual dishes that people ate on in Qumran. And these are the actual cups. If you were at an ancient Passover Seder, or you were at if you were invited to the Last Supper, you would have had a cup like this. Here's cooking pot. These are stone vessels. Big debate about whether stone vessels are used because they do not get ritual impurity according to the Torah's law. Some scholars think that's why they were used. Some people think it just came into style. Whatever the case, stone vessels are here. And this was truly a pantry where apparently the group had communal meals that are described in its main text, the rule of the community. Now, if you read Josephus, you see Josephus describes the Essenes as having communal meals. Now, all these meals are conducted in a great state of ritual purity. So we're going to come back to that in a few minutes when we're going to see that the place was equipped with about 10 mikvaot, Jewish ritual baths. Now, this room in the middle here was said to be a scriptorium. We must remind ourselves that most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were brought to Qumran, copied elsewhere. Many of them are from before there was any occupation of the site by the sectarian group. And despite that fact, it could be that the second story here, or according to research, some other close by rooms may have served for the writing of texts. We can't be certain, but what we can be certain is that there were some inkwells found. Now, I'm not sure if the number of inkwells really proves that some place was used for copying texts. It could have been that it was an accounting house, for all we know. In Caesarea, there actually is such a facility from the Byzantine period where they kept the financial records and collected the taxes. All I'm saying is not that I want to speculate anything one way or another. It appears to us that some texts certainly would have been copied at Qumran, but we don't know how many and which ones completely. And the presence of inkwells does indicate that some people were writing at Qumran. We have a recent book, which I'm actually in the process of finishing, by Sidney White Crawford, which argues greatly for Qumran being in many ways a library and literary center. And certainly there's no question that literary activity was going on and copying of text was going on at Qumran. We just shouldn't think that all the texts were copied there. Now we need to get to understand the sectarian group at the water system. Now, we're going to leave off it sounds a little funny, the water system as a supplier for water. We don't care about that today. That's for your archaeology lecture. How do people get drinking water and cleaning water? I'll just tell you one thing. Don't believe anyone who tells you that all the water installations were used for drinking, bathing, washing clothes, and industrial purposes in the same place. Because I asked a public health expert once about this, and he said in the first year you might make it. By the second year, everybody would be dead if you were bathing your bodies and washing your clothes in the same water you were drinking. So I don't think that was the case. We'll leave that for someone to discuss the water supply, but this is a map of the whole water system. What we need to talk about is just first of all to explain that the water comes from the hills. It's not brought up from the wadi. It rains usually about one time a year. And here the water comes down through this is the aqueduct, believe it or not. You think of these big aqueducts like the Roman aqueduct in Caesarea, but this is an aqueduct. And this aqueduct leads onto the floor and to various installations, beginning with the round cistern, various other cisterns. But this is what's important. There are 10 of these. These are mikvahs. Now, there's some debate about this. There's some scholars want to say they're Roman step pools. They got nothing to do with Judaism. There are hundreds of mikvaot in the land of Israel from the Second Temple period at Qumran, Jerusalem, a few other sites that are important, like Jericho and in the Hasmonean palaces. Maybe as you know, everyone knows at Masada. The bottom line is that these are mikvaot, and they indicate the fact that the sectarian group we're talking about, and this does match what Josephus says about the Essenes, but it also matches priestly groups. They were observing temple purity even outside of the temple. Hence, mikvaot were used not only by women for menstrual impurity, they were used by men for all kinds of impurities in order to live a life in which perfect holiness and purity were being maintained at this sectarian site. Now here's another one. And these mikvaot were supplied in a way that the water flow would have been acceptable by later rabbinic law, even though we don't know from the Dead Sea Scrolls texts what their laws were. Now, I just want to show you that even though some scholars think that this is a mikvah, this is a problem because of its size. The crack in this installation is as a result of the earthquake in 31 BCE, and the channels leading up and down, there's a big debate. Are these because of use of a mikvah to separate from the pure going down and the impure going down and the pure coming up? Or are these channels to allow water to flow into this if it's a cistern or a mikvah? I don't want to get into that because it's not my expertise. But what I do want to say is it's clear that we've seen some mikvaot, and the general opinion is that mikvaot, there were 10 of them in Qumran, and that purity was an extremely important part of the group. So thus far, we've seen that the group did writing, the group did purity laws very carefully. They have all these mikvaot, and the group had communal meals. Now, we need to check the last archaeological thing of significance. We need to check, excuse the spelling error here, is the cemetery. There is a main cemetery with 1,200 graves that are all male. There have been some discussion of female graves, but the females are facing a different way in their Bedouin. I don't want to have to get into the details of this now. They're Bedouin from the 1800s. They're not the original Qumran cemetery. Now, the Qumran cemetery, there's also some side cemetery with some women and children. This is very important because there has been a claim by many scholars that the Qumran sectarians were celibate. This comes from the fact, first of all, that Josephus says about the Essenes, that the Essenes had marrying and also celibate, or we should say non-marrying Essenes. Now, besides that, if you go to the rule of the community, one of the main sectarian texts, which we'll see a slide of later, it does not mention women. I always jokingly ask, the problem in a lecture like this is, you can't see everyone's face, so you don't know if they're smiling, and you can't hear if they're laughing. So I'm about to tell a joke, and I won't know if you like it or not. I always ask the question, what very important American document also does not mention women? And the answer to that question is the US Constitution. And they were not celibate. So whether anybody thinks that's funny or not, it's important. Why is it important? Because despite the fact that the rule of the community does not mention women, we have numerous laws about women which tell us about purity and impurity and marriage laws and who you can marry and who you can't marry and all this kind of stuff. So the problem is, how do we reconcile this? So the standard reconciliation is to say that there were only men at Qumran because that was like the inner core of the sect. And some people say, by the way, of course, Qumran is the Arabic name of the place. It's probably some place called in the Bible Sekhacha, which is pronounced in English Bible language, Sekaka, S-E-C-A-C-A-H, right? But at any rate, it's a place that is mentioned in the city lists in the book of Joshua. But the point I want to make now is that many people think that because of the cemetery, that they must have really been celibate. And here you see some of the graves and one person buried here. The bottom line is that we don't really know, but it could be, and this is my theory personally, that Qumran was a place where you went to progress through the later stages of initiation into the group. Initiation was based on increasing levels of purity. So if that's what Qumran really was, then we would understand why there were mostly men there and a few women and children that perhaps were there with their husbands who were centered there, or some other explanations, but we don't know. And these things are in tension, and it represents a difficult question. A lot of Qumran scholars, I think, would put this in the agree to disagree category, but there's been a turn away from the idea of celibacy, but the problem is that there are no so-called gendered feminine objects at Qumran, not none, almost none. In other words, when you compare Qumran with the excavations of Masada or the Bar Kokhba caves, where women were a big part of the situation there, because they were just regular families running away, right? So what you see is very large numbers of gendered female objects that you would expect. and you simply don't see them here. So it's hard to maintain that there was any kind of equal group of women. But having said that, how we explain it, I've just given you a couple of explanations, but we're still, I think, not sure which one is correct. Now I want to show you, as we transfer into the scrolls, I want to show you first the Tefillin, Phylacteries. There are two kinds of these found in Qumran. There are some that, with their contents, we say are similar to what the Pharisaic rabbinic texts require. Some have the same 4 texts inside of them, but start earlier or later. And here you could see an example of a head tefillin with 4 sections. That these are about 3/8 of an inch. They're like the old German tefillin. You don't see these very much today, but the German Jews had very small tefillin. The Qumran people had very small tefillin. Perhaps they wore them all day, which was the original custom according to rabbinic literature. But at any rate, here you can see the inside, the way they're placed inside the case, the leather case. Leather cases are very small. Many of the ones that we have are very crushed. But despite that fact, these people used phylacteries. Now, I mentioned that there are 2 types of contents. One kind of text is precisely the kind of text that have in them the exact material in rabbinic tefillin. These are the 4 passages that require the wearing of tefillin that are mentioned in the Torah. And these passages are what we call, in this particular case, the Pharisaic rabbinic tefillin. The second type of tefillin start before or after. Now, if we had doing this live, I would say, can anyone tell me what is immediately before the Shema, which is one of the main passages? What is immediately before the Shema in the book of Deuteronomy? And maybe somebody would know that right before the Shema is the 10 Commandments. Since some of the sectarian tefillin start earlier in the Bible and end later in the Bible, that is, they have bigger chunks. And sometimes those chunks include what's before or what's after. If you include what's before, then you end up with the tefillin containing the 10 Commandments, a matter which was common among the sectarian tefillin from Qumran. This is an ongoing research field. We don't have all the answers yet, but there are some very good scholars working on them. There are some tefillin which still have to be, in quotes, opened from Qumran. They're not going to be opened. They're going to be, with sophisticated equipment, they're going to be imaged in the hope that they can be read without opening them, because opening them would destroy them. This is a research project that's actually sort of going on now. I'm not sure if there's very much progress now in the virus situation, but it's an ongoing research project of some scholars working with the colleagues in the Israel Antiquities Authority. And now, in order to discuss the situation of really what is so important about this group, we have to look at the actual sectarian texts. The sectarian texts are going to be informative for us in 2 ways. Number one, they're going to tell us about this group that collected the library at Qumran. But the second is they're going to tell us about other Jews, because they say a lot of nasty things. That's what we call invective. They're also going to tell us about their theology, which we can compare with Judaism as a whole. And you should know the sectarian texts have a specific language and terminology. Somebody wrote me an email about how did they term, what's the teacher of righteousness, this early teacher of the sect, circa 50 BCE, 140 BCE, and he's called the Moreh HaTzedek, the teacher of righteousness, a term that was later used by Karaite Jews, those literalist Jews that didn't accept the oral law, and they started in the 8th century and exist until today still in small communities. And then also, beside that, that term was used in Eastern Europe for rabbinic leaders. At any rate, we're going to have to be looking at the sectarian text to get a sense of what these things tell us about the history of Judaism. Now, first, we're looking now at the text which is called the Rule of the Community. The Rule of Community was one of the 7 original scrolls, and it is the thing that scholars immediately pounced on to compare to Josephus to come up with the Essene theory, which, as I mentioned, is the dominant theory of scrolls identification. Now, this text has numerous parts to it, and as you look at another manuscript, a fragmentary manuscript, let me point out to you that the document begins by stating the theology of the group. The theology of this group, and this links in some ways to Josephus's description of the theology of the Essenes, to which it be compared, but is not exact. And the theology of this group includes the notion that everyone is predestined, whether to be a son of light or a son of darkness, obviously a good person or a bad person, that this predestination has been planned by God, as everything is predestined. This is contrary to what some people think because of the Yiddish word besher. Judaism does not believe in predestination. It believes in the free will of human beings, right? It believes that God can influence our activity if he wants to interfere in that free will, but that generally he does not. Now, that being the case, this sectarian group stands out for believing in this, while the Sadducee group, according to Josephus, believed that God, once he created the universe, did not interfere in human affairs. Josephus says that the Essenes believe that God controls everything, and the Pharisees, the ancestors, the spiritual ancestors of the Talmud, believe in the in-between that I stated before, that God can influence anything he wants, but usually leaves up decisions in our lives up to us. Now, also this document then goes on to describe the initiation process. It's very complex. It's also similar to the initiation process of a core group of Pharisees who observe purity laws in daily life. It's a process whereby one moves to greater and greater knowledge of the secret teachings, while at the same time observing the purity laws more strictly. And the initiate is first allowed to come in contact with solid food, which is pure, and only a year later, after passing a variety of tests, with the liquid food, which is the ultimate membership in the sect, because liquid foods are more susceptible to impurity. This shows us something exceedingly important. There's a wonderful study by an Israeli scholar, Yaakov Licht, of blessed memory, in which he showed that all of this initiation process is based on the very same purity laws that the rabbis have. This is a very important point, because once we understand this, we start to understand that even though the Dead Sea Scrolls sect is in opposition to the view of the Pharisees, the ancestors of all the Judaism of today practically, even though that's the case, we learn from the scrolls the important fact that many principles that are enunciated later on in Talmudic texts go back to earlier times. That doesn't mean everything does. We shouldn't start becoming believers that every single thing goes back and that there was no historical development. No, but many things go back that we really didn't get. Now, when you continue in this text that I'm describing, after all this, you get a code of punishments. This code of punishments is also found in a lot of versions. What are the punishments? Demotion in the purity status and fines of part of the person's food ration. Because remember, they ate communal meals, and you could only eat the communal meal if you were pure. That meant you were pure by being at a certain level in the sect, and it meant you had been in the ritual baths that we saw before. Now, these regulations also could result in expulsion, which we'll be talking about in a minute. But for the most part, these were punishments for violations of sectarian rules. Sectarian rules, some of them would be funny to us, some of them serious. You should excuse me for wanting to tell some jokes again without knowing if anyone's going to laugh. So I will tell you two of the rules that I always thought were a little bit funny. There is one rule that it's forbidden, anybody will be punished if he interrupts his fellow, and these are apparently males, so this is correct, in the meetings of the community. Now, is it really possible to have hundreds of Jews and no one is going to interrupt anybody? So I always thought that was pretty funny. And I do see somebody's laughing. I only see 5 people on the screen, which is a problem. My computer doesn't allow me to see everybody at once. And actually, as we're getting used to these Zoom programs, I maybe should get enough memory to put everybody up on a second screen. But at any rate, and the second funny one is that, this group was quite modest. And they used to wear a tunic and then a toga-like thing, tallis-like, big tallis-like thing over it. So at any rate, right, there is a rule there that you may not gesticulate with your left hand. And the reason is because if you gesticulate with your left hand, it's said in the text, your garment may fall off, and if you have a hole in the tunic, the undergarment, then you will be indecently exposed. So they don't trust 2 layers of clothing. At any rate, with these kind of humorous examples, there are other very serious examples, like not gossiping about other members to people outside the sect, not revealing the teachings of the sect, and other things like that that had to be observed by these people. Now, we didn't have a chance to discuss this. I'm going to quickly tell you that a few texts later found at Qumran were originally found in the Cairo Geniza, already in the 1890s. And the Cairo Geniza, if you haven't had lectures about, you need to. It's a very important subject. At any rate, the Cairo Geniza, this collection of manuscripts found in Egypt, starting in the 1860s, and 250,000 fragments were brought to Cambridge, England. And among the material in England was a Geniza copy of a text that we now call the Damascus document, originally called the Sadducite fragments, because the Sadducite, which is the same word as Sadducee, Tzduki, that group of priests is constantly talked about in the document. This document appeared in 10 manuscripts at Qumran, so now we know it's a Dead Sea Scroll, of which there were 2 manuscripts from the Middle Ages in the Cairo Geniza materials. Now, this particular fragment is a fragment of the expulsion of a person from the sect in accord with the rule of the community. That the rule of the community says that if a person violates the laws to a certain extent, they can be expelled. And when they are expelled, they're just kicked out. And the text actually ends, and he will leave, because they kicked the guy out. Now, Josephus talks about Essenes kicked out of the group because they didn't follow the rules, who then were left to starve because they had taken an oath to eat pure food and now couldn't get the pure food of the sect, whatever sect it was. Now, I've always questioned that because of my belief that if I was kicked out of a group, I'd say the heck with you. And I'd violate these purity laws. But apparently, Josephus says something different. So at any rate, we get a sense now that the sect observed very great purity laws. And I'm going back now to the rule of the community without turning the slide back, because I want to tell you that the rule of the community also contains a beautiful poem at the end. And this poem is the first mention of the recitation of Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, and you shall love the Lord your God, and you should recite it when you get up in the morning and you go to sleep, and when you get up in the morning. This is mentioned, or let's put another way, strongly alluded to in this poem. This makes a very important point that I have to tell you. There is such a thing as common Judaism. Scholars talk about it. It means we talk, you're this sect, you're that sect, the third sect. What's common Judaism? Go to synagogue today, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Hasidic. Guess what? Everybody has a Torah. The Torah has got not only the same text, it's written with the same ancient way, it's written by the same kind of scribes. The Torah is the Torah. Or, right, every synagogue recites, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. We have many differences. We forget to talk about what's in common. Well, in Second Temple times, there's a lot common to Jews and to Judaism. And that's why there are a lot of things done in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like the reading of the Shema, like saying prayers, right, equivalent to the morning sacrifice and equivalent to the afternoon sacrifice. And these activities are activities which are very much like what the Pharisees would have done and what are later reflected in the rabbinic tradition. This, I should tell you, is also true. This Damascus document that you see a piece of right here has a list of Shabbat laws. These Shabbat laws, many of them are the same as the ones we're used to. Big difference, however. Laws that the rabbis made based on the prophets are here considered Torah laws, because this group considers even laws based on the prophets to be at the level of Torah laws. Someone calling can't see the map. There is no map.
Visuals.
Somebody can't see the visuals? I think everybody sees the visuals, right? Wave your arm if you can see the visuals. Yeah? Yeah, so this person's in trouble. They called my house to say, my wife just came to say someone called at my house. So whoever this is, I don't really believe I can help, and I'm very sorry about that, but hopefully you'll be able to see it on the recorded copy. Now, as we move ahead, I mentioned very quickly last time that the sectarians had a type of exegesis interpretation where they took the prophets as relevant to their own time. This is where we learn about the history of the sect, how they broke off from the Jerusalem standard Judaism as a result of certain disagreements. And eventually there comes a person called the teacher of righteousness who leads them in their separation. Eventually, we know that they located Qumran. While you're looking at this manuscript, I want you to notice the divine names written in the old Hebrew script, which to them was sort of more holy. And that's an interesting side issue I just want you to see. Now, this interpretation, however, says that the words of the prophets apply to today, and says that the only true interpretation of the prophets is the interpretation of the teacher of righteousness. And I made a mistake because I showed you this slide last time, and I told you I'm not going to show you the same slides. And here's another one I showed you, which is the Pesher on the book of Nahum, Nahum as we pronounce it in English. But these texts are very important for helping us to understand that the sectarians saw themselves in opposition to the mainstream. So here we go to the only real historical data in the scrolls. Pesher Nahum describes the following thing. After Yonatan the Maccabee, who we mentioned before, there come John Hyrcanus, known as Yochanan Kohen Gadol in the Talmud, Yochanan the high priest, and then there comes Alexander Judaeus. Alexander Judaeus was the Hasmonean, that is Maccabean ruler, from the period of 103 BCE to 76 CE. Alexander Judaeus was so hated. And now I'm going to tell you a story that Josephus tells and this document Pesher Nahum tells. He was so hated that the Pharisees went and invited the Syrian ruler, whose name was Demetrius, we call him Demetrius III, Eukyros, to attack their king. Imagine this. This is like some party in Israel calls up King Abdullah and says, we don't like Netanyahu, please come and do a military attack on our country. Imagine such a thing. So this is what they did. Now, Josephus doesn't tell us the Pharisees did it because he's embarrassed to tell us they did such a terrible thing. But here we know it's the Pharisees because it's a code word, Ephraim, for the Pharisees. Now, what happens here is the Pharisees come, they call them in, they come in, and this army of Syrian soldiers, they come to Jerusalem, and of course they're committing robbery and murder and rape, and now the Pharisees say, oh my God, what have we done? So they switch sides, and they help Judaeus, Alexander Yanai, known in the Talmud as Yanai HaMelech, to defeat the enemy. So then they figure everything's going to be fine. You know what Judaeus does to them? He really was a bad man. But nonetheless, they had done something terrible. He crucified 800 of them, Josephus tells us, and while lying on some divan, whatever you call it in correct English pronunciation, excuse me, D-I-V-A-N, while lying on it, he has these people who are crucified, he forces them to watch the murder of their wives and children while they were dying. Well, the text here mentions, specifically in the Pesher, it mentions that he crucified these people, something that had never been done before in Israel, because crucifixion is not a Jewish punishment. At any rate, here we get the one piece of real history, which helps us to understand and to know from this text that the group who did what Josephus described was the Pharisees. So this is a great example, but I have to tell you, maybe unique one, about how the sect material helps us to understand Second Temple history. We will see another example that's pretty good in a few minutes. Now I want to tell you that the Dead Sea Scrolls yielded much poetry. Now this looks like a text that was crunched up because you wanted to throw it in your garbage pail. Today we don't do this because of recycling. It took me a long time to get out of the habit and keep this junk I don't want flat. But at any rate, this text was crunched up that way. It's called the Hodayot. Now, Hodayot in English is called the Thanksgiving Scroll. So it's not to be recited at the holiday of Thanksgiving. But I happened to be once in a synagogue on Thanksgiving weekend as a guest. And the president of that synagogue, whom I don't know very well, was a wise guy. So he got up in front of the group at the end of the Sabbath morning service and announced that in the afternoon, without asking me, I didn't mind that, it's okay, in the afternoon that I would be giving a lecture in the afternoon about the Thanksgiving scroll. So I gave a lecture about the Thanksgiving scroll. We had a nice crowd, and it was a good laugh when he did. At any rate, this text has beautiful poetry, but I got to tell you, it tells us about the sect because it tells us that they believed again in absolute predestination. It tells us something else very important. I got to tell you, maybe half or 3/4 of the scroll could be put into the High Holy Day prayer book, and you'd think it's a traditional prayer. But there's a part of this scroll that has very negative views about physicality and is very big on the difference between spirit and flesh. Now, generally, the Pauline emphasis, this is for next lecture on the New Testament, but anyway, in early Christianity, generally the Pauline emphasis, and I may have to show you a different slide of this text next time, the Pauline emphasis on the difference between spirit and flesh is generally explained as coming from the Hellenistic environment. But it may be that on some level, it comes from texts like this. But I want to tell you in our talk today about the history of Judaism, why this text is so important. This text is part of a very big corpus of post-biblical Hebrew poetry preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I mentioned the High Holy Day prayer book. Much of the High Holy Day prayer book is structured on poems that were written in the 500s, the 6th century, by what we call Paitanim. This means early Jewish poets. These obviously Paitan is from the same word as poetas. Now, these poets are a link in a Hebrew poetry history that starts with biblical poetry, like Psalms, then runs to material like what's in the Dead Sea Scroll, and then runs to material which is in the earliest rabbinic levels of the prayer book, where there are things that look like prose today because they print them the wrong way, but they're really poetry, and then runs into this piyut of 500, 600s, and then runs to your real medieval Hebrew poetry of later poets that we know, like Yehuda Halevi and many other Jewish poets who sometimes influenced the prayer book, but also wrote many other beautiful poems. Now here it's important to recognize that we don't always know what's sectarian in the poetry and what's just Jewish poetry. And that will also happen with the next text that was also found at Masada. This is a work that is called the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. It has contact with the earliest historical levels of Jewish mysticism. And it's clear that many elements of Jewish mysticism, not most, but many, are already present in Second Temple times. They may come into Talmudic literature, but they may also maintain an esoteric underground tradition, which helps them to come up later on in varieties of Jewish mysticism. And this text, like the Kedusha part of the prayer book, mentions the idea of the angels praising God. That's its main theme. And it's again, very beautiful poetry. But here's a really interesting thing. It was found in Masada. They also had manuscripts of it there. And the great archaeologist Yigal Yadin was convinced that this was because people ran away from Qumran to Masada, and that these people who ran away brought their texts with them, and that's why it's there. Now, there are a few texts that are also at Qumran, also Masada. The other view that I hold is, and by the way, Yadin was a great, great scholar, so don't figure I'm right. You know, I joked with you, I think, last time, when other people say I'm real right and they're wrong. With Yigal Yadin, I wouldn't run to say that so quickly. I owe him a debt. He wrote me a 10-year letter, and he was a person that I had a wonderful relationship and a very great, great scholar. But anyhow, I disagree with him on this. I think this was common Jewish literature. It's part of that group 2 that I said there are 3 groups. There's Bible, there's this apocrypha-like general Jewish literature from Second Temple times, and there's sectarian. I think that in Masada, they had a lot of texts that are also Qumran, because it's common Second Temple literature. That's my view. Yadin, as I say, had the other view. But he might be right. I wouldn't say about him that he has to be wrong. Okay, now we're on my favorite scroll, the Temple Scroll. I am right now awaiting samples of a new book that I, together with Professor Andrew Gross of Catholic University, completed on the Temple Scroll. And I wrote 2 previous books, and now we have a whole new edition with all the manuscripts. And this is a text which rewrites the Bible. the Torah basically, starting at the point where the Jews are commanded to build a tabernacle. It substitutes the building of a gargantuan temple. Now, this gargantuan temple would have covered the whole of what was then the city of Jerusalem, but its third courtyard was being built, as opposed to the two of the regular temple, to extend sanctity further out and to raise the levels of sanctity. But the text is loaded with fascinating interpretations of the Torah, and Yigael Yadin, in his edition of this text is a great story. Yadin acquired this in the 67 war. He had been first offered it in 1960. Then in May of 67, it was offered to an American scholar, and Yadin knew that it was in Bethlehem. And in the 67 war, Israeli security forces went to the place where it was. Eventually, they paid the guy $108,000 for this scroll, and it's a fantastic document. The point I want to make here, however, is that Yadin speculated that there were polemics in it against laws that in the rabbinic texts were identified as basically Pharisaic rabbinic laws. Now, no one really understood, including me, what Yadin meant until 1984, when we learned about a text called MMT, Miktzat Ma'aseh HaTorah. This text is an absolutely fascinating text because it is a foundation document of the sectarian group in which they write that they have left for certain reasons, and they appeal to the people they're writing to. And I'm going to have to save time and tell you that, in my view, this comes from the time of Jonathan the Hasmonean, circa 152 BCE. And the text indicates that the sect was founded when the high priesthood was taken over by the Maccabees, who made common cause with the Pharisees because they opposed the Sadducees, that upper class priestly group, for having allowed the Hellenization process of the temple. Now, let's remember, the temple during the years leading up to the Maccabean revolt, which is before the revolt started in 168, ended in 164, in those years, there was tremendous Hellenization while the Sadducee priests were in control. And because Jonathan the Hasmonean, opposed them, he put in Pharisaic Jewish law rituals into the temple, and these guys left. And in my view, that's how the sect got started. But whether you agree with me or not about that, and many people don't, you have to agree that in this document, in which the sectarians say, we believe this, and we think you're wrong because you believe that, there are one after another laws here in which the legal tradition of the sectarians is the same as the Sadducees. And the legal tradition of the opponents is the one of the Pharisees. Now, this is unbelievably important for the history of Judaism in general for the following reason. It allows us to identify a variety of later ideas found in rabbinic texts as going back to Second Temple time. It allows us to know that certain specific rabbinic principles existed in Second Temple times and go back to before the destruction of the temple. And it allows us to reconstruct various Sadducean views, which apparently the sectarians, whether they are Essenes or aren't Essenes, had as their Jewish law halakha ruling. So we learned that the Jewish law of our sectarian group was similar to the Sadducees, which makes sense since sons of Tzadok, Zadok in English, are all over the Dead Sea Scrolls, said to be leaders of the group. Now, this conclusion shows us that Yadin was right, that many of the laws of the Temple Scroll reflect Sadducee-like rulings, which the sectarians accepted, and therefore they are unspoken polemics against rules of the Pharisees, which had to exist at that time. So many Pharisaic laws can now be identified and dated to an earlier period as a result of the information between the Temple Scroll and the MMT document. MMT means Miktzat Ma'aseh HaTorah, some words of the Torah. A point of information of modern history that the New York Times, when this text was not published, they issued on a Christmas or the day before Christmas in 1991 an editorial demanding the full publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were not published. This is a very important text, and if you read my book, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll see I start the book with this text. We now have one more topic to take up, which is the relationship of the scrolls to Messianism. The scrolls take up Messianism as a very important topic. The war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness assumes that there will be a great war in the end of days, and that this war will usher in the sectarians being the victors, and that they will be taking back Jerusalem, running the temple in the Messianic era. Furthermore, a text called The Rule of the Congregation tells us about how they will be organized in the end of days and how their attempt to attain perfect holiness will be complete in the end of days because of by the way, if you buy a Dead Sea Scrolls tie, which you shouldn't because they're too thick and too wide, can't wear them anymore today. But if you buy a Dead Sea Scrolls tie, this text is on the scroll because it doesn't have any mentions of God and any biblical verses. Okay, I wrote a whole book about this text, right? But anyhow, this text, the rule of the congregation, not community, which is the rule for the current period, but for the congregation in the end of days, tells you about the Messianic banquet, and it also tells you about a very important thing. The sectarians had two separate views of the Messiah. One was that there was one Messiah, son of David, just like the one that underlies most of the Jewish points of view. And also we'll talk next week about it in Christianity. The second thing is that we also have here in this text, in this text, a two Messiah theory, where there is a priestly Messiah, because to this view, the most important role of the Messiah is the reestablishment of the correct temple, parenthesis, with the Sadducean rulings, not the ones of the Pharisees. And then we also have, besides this, right, a second Messiah in the two Messiah context, who is a Messiah of Israel. That is, there's a temporal ruler and a priestly ruler. Now I want to show you some texts about Messianism that have to some extent been talked about in public. And here is one that was called the Pierced Messiah text. It has nothing to do with the Pierced Messiah. It's a text in which describes in reality the destruction of that the prince of the sect, as he called him, the prince of the congregation, who is regarded as a Davidic descendant, his defeat of the Romans. And this is because most scholars think that the War Scroll and associated texts were written right before 63 BCE, when the Romans were getting ready to conquer the land of Israel. Now, be careful here, because the conquest by the Romans led to Roman rule, but this is way before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. This is starting in 63 BCE, when they conquered the land of Israel. And then here is another very interesting text, which maybe would have been better to reserve for next week, but it's a beautiful text describing the various blessings. And this text reads a bit like the Beatitudes of the New Testament, but Jewish listeners or watchers will recognize it because it's a series of things beginning with the word Ashrei, happy are. And there are various Jewish liturgical things where the text begins that way. And this is an example here of already pointing to what we're going to be talking about next week, where there are parallels between the scrolls and early Christianity, because some aspects of Second Temple Judaism reflected in Christianity are ones that we found among the sectarians rather than among the Pharisaic, let's call them proto-rabbis. And that's also the case with this text, in which a Messiah is referred in Aramaic as a son of God. But when we get to one other messianic text here, you'll see that this text here, which is known as the Messianic Apocalypse, has a description of the Messiah, and then speaks about in the Messianic era how God will heal the sick and revive the dead. And it reads like the first paragraph of the Amida and includes a basic Jewish understanding of a Messianic era, which would be an era without misfortune and without disease and without, this is, by the way, not the view of Maimonides in the Middle Ages, who argues that the Messianic era, everything will be natural and normal. He's not going to have any 15-foot, according to Maimonides, 15-foot strawberries or gigantic peaches and all those things described in the temple. From Maimonides, the Messianic era is the same as, he quotes the Talmud, as the regular era of today, except that there would not be a situation in which Jews are subject to the rule of enemies of theirs. So at any rate, though, that particular approach is not the one of the sectarians. The sectarians have a much more apocalyptic, non-natural view. Just quickly to sum it up, that there would be a massive messianic war. They would take over the temple. There'd be a world of perfect holiness. Everybody would be living a blessed life in this perfect world of holiness. All evildoers and all evil would be destroyed. Now, just one last scroll, and that's called the Copper Scroll. This is an amazing text. It was found in Cave 3 of Qumran. It is engraved on copper. Apparently, the workers didn't really know what they were doing because they made a lot of mistakes. Scholars differ about the readings, but it's a description of some 63 or 64 treasures that are buried in the Judean desert and in and around Jerusalem. Some scholars think they're real treasures of the Second Temple. Some people think that this is not associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was just put there in the Qumran caves at the area time, right before the time of destruction of the temple. But I'll tell you that the real treasure of this scroll for us is that it points to the transition between the Hebrew of the Qumran sectarians and Mishnaic Hebrew, which is the next dialect of Hebrew in the history of the language, running from biblical through the Dead Sea Scrolls and through things like the Copper Scroll until Hebrew arrives at what we call Mishnaic Hebrew in its historical progression through the ages, which of course culminates in our own day in modern Hebrew. So we'll close by saying that the Second Temple period is an amazing period in Jewish history. I have not been able today to talk about more than the smallest part. There is a series of studies on the Dead Sea Scrolls that's issued by one of our main publishers, Brill Academic Publishers in the Netherlands, and they're up to like volume 181. And everything I told you here is not even the full, anywhere near the full amount in any one survey book of the Dead Sea Scrolls, let alone in all the scholarship and all the texts that we have unearthed. But I've tried to give you a taste of why it is and how it is that the scrolls are teaching us a lot about Second Temple Judaism. We have to join those texts that we have now and the things we talked about today with what we already knew from Josephus, from other works, the books of the Maccabees, many other texts, and altogether our picture of the Second Temple period as a period of inner Jewish debate and disagreement, and yet of tremendous development of Jewish ideas and Jewish law. And today we talked about a few things. It was absolutely tremendous, and the scrolls are enabling us to know so much more than we ever knew. So we'll close here and open up for questions with our host again. Thank you very much. I hope to see you all next week, and I hope we have some good questions today.
Thank you. Would you unshare the screen for 1 second?
I already was on it before you said so.
Yeah.
I hope you don't see it anymore.
I don't. We just see you and all people. So a few good questions I had, and people chat your questions. We'll go through them. What is the oldest actual scroll that's been dated in the Dead Sea Scrolls? How old is it? And which one is it?
225 BCE.
Which one is it? Which scroll?
It's a manuscript of the one we usually claim is oldest is a manuscript of Samuel. It's called 4Q Samuel B. It comes from Cave 4 at Qumran, and it's a It's a manuscript of part of the book of Samuel. It was originally a manuscript of the whole Samuel, but we just have little pieces of it.
What other items besides Tefillin, like Jewish items, were found at Qumran?
Well, here is the thing. There are numerous inscriptions from Qumran recently published. And I don't know what you mean by Jewish.
Like a talit, like tzitzit.
There is a small amount of cloth. But you see, I have to explain something. The word talit in our use is when it's used for prayer. That didn't exist until Jews stopped wearing, let's call it old-fashioned Greco-Roman period Jewish clothes. Because when they did, the fringed garment was what you wore on your outside garment. So the talit, as we know it, is a garment made once you don't have that for ritual. So the earliest talit of that kind is medieval, when Jews stopped wearing Jewish clothes or whatever, Middle Eastern clothes, who knows exactly when. So the point is that the garments that we found, there's a lot of cloth from Masada and Bar Kokhba caves as well, but these are part of that story, but it's not a prayer garb. So it doesn't tell you very much about anything. It's regular clothes that people wore as their daily clothing.
You mentioned that there were some pieces found in the Cairo Geniza. So why would those items make their way to the Cairo Geniza?
Well, it'd be great to know this. There are two theories. One is that some elements of our sectarian group went underground, and their ideas reemerge when Karaism comes into being in the 8th century BCE. And that's one theory. The second theory, and by the way, that is helped by the fact that some Karaite texts mention cave dwellers in the history of Judaism, as if it's some kind of sect of the cave tribe, cave dwellers. Now, there also is a second theory, which is that there were some discoveries reported in the 2nd century, and then also later on in the, if I remember correctly, the 9th century. And these discoveries, however, are said to be of biblical manuscripts. But it could be that some materials were discovered and got there somehow. Beyond that, we don't know. There are versions of the apocryphal book of Tobit. This is not the only Second Temple text in the Cairo Geniza, but they're just a couple. Most important, there are manuscripts in Hebrew of the book of Ben Sira, which is found in some scraps at Qumran, but for real found in a big manuscript of Masada. And there are some Hebrew manuscripts of that in a medieval guise found in the Cairo Geniza as well.
You mentioned there was the overlap between the temple scroll showing what was common to the sect that was at Qumran and Pharisaic Judaism. Can you give us a few examples? You mentioned generally that there were some overlaps, just a few examples of what.
Well, okay. So let me give you a real example where you see the Sadducee view in, and let me mention this. There, in fact, I'll mention the one that is most what we call the smoking gun, which is a little hard to understand, but I'm going to do it anyhow. The Pharisees believed, and rabbinic law believes, that when a person is on the last day of purification from some ritual impurity, once they have immersed and brought the necessary sacrifice during the day, they are partially pure until sunset. After sunset, they're totally pure. Partially pure means that there are many things that this person could do which they would not be permitted to do right now if they were not partially pure, like eating pure food. Sadducee law, over and over, there are 9 examples of this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's in the Temple Scroll, repeats that one must literally follow the Torah, that when the sun goes down, one is pure. Hence, this particular status of in-between, called Tavul Yom, one who immersed on that day, does not exist in the Sadducee view and exists in the Pharisee view. That is 9 times in Dead Sea Scroll literature, including the Temple Scroll and MMT, that fragmentary document I showed you. And anybody who follows this is following Sadducee law, and it's in the Temple Scroll and it's in the Dead Sea Scroll.
Thank you. Rabbi Linson wants to know, in the scroll of the congregation at the banquet at the time of Messiah, is there a description of eating the Leviathan? I guess he's getting hungry right now.
There's the old joke, why they have fish at the Messianic banquet, because some people don't trust the kashrut of God's slaughter. But leaving that joke aside, there is no Leviathan being eaten at the Messianic. They don't tell us the menu. In fact, they do tell us part of the menu, bread and wine.
Sorry, just a general question. How did you in particular get interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls? A little bit about your background and why this is your passion or your focus of your life study.
Funny story. So the answer to this is that I was a student at Brandeis, and for my senior honors thesis, it was suggested by the Bible scholar Nachum Sarna, of blessed memory, that I work on the Hodayot scroll, which I did. I actually still have the paper. But at any rate, I did a senior honors thesis on that. Then I took 2 courses on Dead Sea Scrolls, and I was looking for a dissertation topic that would make use of skills in Bible studies and Talmudic studies. Someone said, go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I went to the Dead Sea Scrolls and never got out of it. Although I have to tell you, I published a lot of things. You can go to my academia.edu site, a lot of stuff on other ancient Jewish subjects, but a lot of them do intersect with the scrolls. And I'm actually putting together a book now of about 40 articles that are not about the scrolls. That'll be a kind of collected works volume, so people can see some of that stuff too. But I really became addicted, I admit it, to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Does the Dead Sea Scrolls at all have any discussion, any of the scrolls that you mentioned about the feminine aspect of God? Something that we see a lot in Kabbalah?
No, you do not have this Kabbalistic notion, does not exist. Now, to speak in some very quick general terms, the Kabbalistic notion of the feminine side of God is based on the idea of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, which is feminine. However, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like most of the texts from this period, and also like the biblical quote that appears in the Kedusha prayer, blessed be God from his place, right? God's presence is defined by the Hebrew word kavod, which also means honor, but it means the divine presence. So it's clear that, let's put it this way, there's no verbalizing of a feminine aspect of God until you hit the rabbinic tradition that basically gets the Kabbalistic tradition of that idea going.
Just a side question, was wondering whether the Tefillin that are being examined are at the Digital Restoration Initiative at University of Kentucky.
No, well, yes and no. University of Kentucky did this fantastic work along with the Israel Antiquities Authority and Tel Aviv University to read a scroll that could not be unrolled of Leviticus that came from the synagogue in En Gedi that was burned in the Ark and is probably from, it turned out that the text is exactly our Leviticus. But anyhow, it was apparently burned at some point and is somewhere, it dated by different people between the 4th and the 7th century. I think the earlier date is probably most likely. At any rate, this was read by a very sophisticated technique developed in Kentucky. Something like that technique is indeed being hopefully used in this work, but they haven't gotten anywhere near that level in this project, which is frankly a little bit of a disappointment. I hope you hear good news from the project, but they haven't gotten to that level yet. They started with the crime labs in Israel, and then they went to the people who do medical testing, and then they finally got to the point where they realized they need this type of an approach, but it hasn't gotten far enough yet.
Last question, or can you give us a intro for our program for next week, the last in your 3-part series, what you'll be talking about?
Yeah, I can give you an intro.
Promo.
There's a lot of stuff in the scrolls that was a part of Second Temple Judaism, and as part of Second Temple Judaism was part of the background of Christianity. Now, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we often did not know where some of these ideas came from. And now, with the benefit of the scrolls, we can see that some of them that we thought might have been drawn from Hellenistic or other sources were developed on a Jewish model. That's a good part of what we're going to be talking about. We're also going to be emphasizing aspects which are at variance with that model. But one other thing which we're going to have to do a little bit is just to mention why some of the crazy theories are nuts. You know, Jesus and John the Baptist are not mentioned in the scrolls. I don't want to spend too much time on the crazy theories, as I didn't want to today, but we will take a few minutes just to make sure that you understand why some of those things can't be, and how it is that we should properly be using the scrolls to understand the background of the New Testament.
Okay, so with that, thank you, everybody. I have to get dressed up in my Yontif outfit and go record some stuff at the shul. So I wish you all a happy rest of your Sunday. If it's not too hot, go outside, get some air. And sorry for, I thought I asked you where you were situated, Professor Schiffman, and I thought you said Manhattan. What do I know? So you're in Long Island, so that means you get a breeze, right? You get an ocean breeze there.
Okay.
Okay.
Hopefully see you all next week. Thank you.
Okay. See you all next week, everybody. Keep safe. Nice to see you again. Hope you're enjoying your learning. I'll be emailing you a copy of the program and some ancillary reading materials for your enjoyment with the help of the professor. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye. Bye, Professor Schiffman. Thank you again. Bye, guys. Bye, Batya and Marty. Hey, Rosella. Idasi Sylvain Capel. Yeah. Hope I pronounced that right. I did? Sylvain? Okay, good. Okay. Bye, Phillips couple. Susan and David, good to see you. Keep well. Okay.